historically the future of warfighting. Simultaneously, there's kind of been an evolvement of counter tactics and technologies. And I was wondering if you could sort of, that's not something people talk about too much, if you could just shed light on what you think the future of counter tactics look like for drones or possibly joint operations.
First of all, warfare is an art. And when you start with the premise, it's not a science, it's an art. And there's everything that at one moment is offensive can quickly become defensive. This yin-yang balance without, again, geeking people out on that. But that's just the nature of what it is. Whenever you have a strength, such as the United States has in, say, air power, somebody's going to come up with some way to defeat it. If not, they get killed. They get wiped out. They won't survive. So anybody who's going to stand up against us or any other developed power is always going to develop an asymmetric approach, which simply means figuring out how to not get zapped by the other guy's strengths, and then how to strike at their weaknesses. Sometimes those weaknesses are political. They're not military per se, and sometimes the two are fused, such as inflicting casualties that play in the press, that sort of thing. But in the case of drones, what are the weak points of drones? Well, for one thing, they don't fly by wire. They're controlled by radio signal, ultimately, right? And sometimes the signals are bounced off satellites, and sometimes they're handheld radios that people can make in their garage. So you don't necessarily want to defeat the drone. You want to defeat the system. So it could be figuring out how to interrupt the electronic warfare piece that I spoke about earlier, that interrupted the remote-controlled IED piece. It's a pretty simple concept, but it's very complicated. So you can always come up with that. The swarming technique is one of the most effective things I've seen, which is we have these great drones, cheap bunches of drones coming after those drones that are less expensive, that drones that dive in and hit that sort of thing. So I can't give you an answer for each and every scenario, but you figure out how to defeat the system itself, and it's not always a kinetic solution, meaning sending a bullet through it or blowing it up. It's often disrupting the link. That may go into cyber, as the gentleman had brought up, if there's a way to disrupt it through cyber means.
Just riffing off of that for a second, I mean, I think that the really quick answer is, our military's become hyper-dependent on GPS, right? That's basic, although drones are controlled by radio or by satellite. I mean, it's a lot of it is setting, go to this GPS coordinate, go to that GPS coordinate, go to the next one. Similarly, a lot of, just a lot of communications, what have you, are all tied into GPS, how we target things. The small, teeny tiny problem is you can disrupt a GPS signal for depending on how big the effect you want, $50, $100, $1,000. It's not super hard. So DARPA, which is like the super forward-thinking arm of the military's R&D, is trying to come up with ways to sort of do all those things without GPS. And they're having a super hard time. And the answer is you can't do one thing. You've got to do a lot of things. You got to try a lot of different tactics, and you got to try a lot of different technologies at once. So if I was like Dr. Evil, what I would invest in, I'd go long on GPS jamming.
Kinetic knockdown of satellites is the other one. That's an inexpensive way to take out a lot of GPS stuff. If the Chinese want to invest in carriers and sixth generation aircraft, keep going, boys. That is hard. It's expensive. When they start kinetic knockdown of satellites, that makes me feel very uncomfortable. Not that I think that we're about to go to war with China. I think there's lots of reasons for that not to occur. So I think it's a great question. Warfare is always about adaptation. There was a great quote. You probably know who this was. That there's two types of warfare: asymmetric warfare and dumb warfare. So you'll either be successful by doing things that the enemy doesn't want you to do, or you'll lose. So right now, we are still at the national level structured to adapt, I would argue, on Cold War cycles. So we build things like major platforms over 20 or 30 years. What we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan is that we've got smart enemies who will adapt in months, and we can spend a lot of money, and they're always inside our OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act. So they're inside our huddle in football terms. So we're going to need to figure out how to do that. I would say that our military forces over the last 12 years, I think absolutely with the Army on the leading edge of this, and the Marine Corps, have shown that they are highly adaptive organizations. Our bureaucracies have largely not changed over the last 12 years. That's going to have to happen because this continuing rapid adaptation is going to be the signature of any future conflict. The next threat is not going to be an IED, but it is going to be based on adaptive capability development. Again, when I was doing some war games with Dave Kilcullen looking at urban combat, we said that the enemy will have an adaptive capability development capability, and that will be critically important. So in the same way that we saw people spinning out IEDs, doing different things so that we couldn't jam, we couldn't roll, we couldn't do whatever it was, in the future, people are going to have drones that have been doing that, or weapon systems we haven't even thought of. So we're going to have to figure out how to adapt with that, and it's going to be a problem.